Good morning and good afternoon. This is Anush Newman from Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, e-Training for Settlement Workers 101. Welcome to our February 21st session. I'm glad to see so many of you joining us today. Our discussion question today is the following. A sponsored refugee tells you they had met another arrived refugee whose sponsors gave them a car, new high-end furniture, and higher monthly income support. They are upset because their sponsors are not providing the same. How would you respond to that? So it would be a good idea to ask the newcomer, how were you sponsored to Canada? Were you sponsored by a community sponsorship or groups of 5 or sponsorship agreement holders? And explain to them the differences, and also ask them, your sponsors, is this their first sponsorship or not? And also some other questions that need to be asked. Is the group that sponsored you, are they sponsoring other people as well at the same time? So then you'll have a good understanding that these sponsors are spreading themselves along many applications. And we see that quite often, especially in group of 5. I've seen a lot of that where one individual is involved in 5, 6 different groups of 5 because they sponsor for each other and things like that. So understanding those factors, it'll be easy to explain to the newcomer as to, why there are differences in terms of the kind of support they receive. As we all know that when sponsors agree to do sponsorship, they enter into contractual agreement. The sponsors are required to provide the minimum requirements stated in the agreement, and any additional things they choose to give, that's a choice they make, but they're not required to do that. And also this explains, I just wanted to add another point, the fact that sometimes sponsors, especially we saw this during the Syrian refugee crisis, that they were able to collect lots of money because of the interest and the media. And some refugees who were sponsored via different streams received a lot of additional items and supports. And now we don't see that as much. So I've seen families that were sponsored during that time, their sponsors had raised over 50,000 just to support a family of 3, just because they got very engaged and very dedicated and active and raised lots of money, and they had lots of money to give to the newcomers. In some situations where the sponsors will provide new furniture, newer stuff, and sometimes the sponsors provide used furniture and things like that, as long as it's reasonable, in a reasonable condition, reasonable shape. We've done that. I know the community in Vancouver, there had brought in a lot of people in a very short time. I'm very familiar with the community, and I know that had caused a little bit of a distress to the community, because all of a sudden many people were arriving that they sponsored at the same time. And we know this has happened in Toronto as well. How did that impact the sponsors in your location when all of a sudden they received large number of refugees arriving and they had to come up and support everybody? That's wonderful. That's very true. Sharing the information about the sponsorship cost and what the sponsors are obligated to provide at minimum, which is that schedule that we have on our website. Actually, it's the government schedule on the sponsorship cost, and also, of course, realizing that once the families arrive, the sponsors have to recalculate the cost using the RAP calculator to ensure that the arriving families are meeting the financial needs based on the location and the standard of living in those locations, meaning families who have arrived, let's say, into a small community where rents are cheaper and cost of living is less, versus somebody arriving into a big center like Toronto or Vancouver, where cost of living is much higher and the cost has to be calculated based on that region. So sharing that information with them, it's also very important for them to understand that as long as they're receiving their what we call basic necessities based on that schedule, then that's what will help them to better understand. Yes, we see that happening across Canada. Even now with the Afghani refugees arriving to Canada, a lot of nonprofit organizations are stepping in and supporting the sponsors with different resources and not financial support, but furniture support, equipment supports, and things like that. That's the spirit of the community, which is wonderful. Yeah, because everybody has invested in the community, right? We're all members of the same community. When we support each other, it's better for us and also for the newcomers. Their settlement process is smoother and their integration is faster. Okay, so right now we're going to do a quick review of the private sponsorship and responsibilities of the sponsors. So just to remind everyone that refugees must receive financial support to cover their basic needs for the entire sponsorship period, 12 months from the day they arrive at the airport, or until they become self-sufficient, or whichever comes first. And we're going to talk more in details about this one. However, after the arrival, as we mentioned earlier, there is a need to review the family size and composition and readjust the sponsorship financial support to make sure that the money that has been allocated provides them with their basic necessities based on the community that they are living in. And if there's any changes to the family composition, let's say an additional family member was born during that time, or a youngster who was under 18 before they arrived, and they had reached age of maturity, which we'll cover later on, then the cost of the sponsorship needs to be recalculated. Okay, and the other sort of the prong or the element of sponsorship is the settlement assistance. Refugees must receive settlement supports from their sponsors during that sponsorship period, regardless whether they become self-sufficient, meaning let's say if they're working and they have money, they're still needing to continue to receive settlement supports from their sponsors. So how can we improve on that? Of course, let's look at what we call an alliance with, of course, we have the sponsors, we have the refugees, and we have the settlement workers. So creating an alliance that includes those three members working towards the best settlement supports and financial supports for the newcomers. And how does that affect the settlement? Of course, the more collaboration between these three and open dialogue and conversation, the smoother the settlement will take place. We know that some SAWs, I know, had a lot of experience and they were able to provide more support, and some new sponsors kind of learning as they're going about how to manage the sponsorship responsibilities. So one of the most important factors making sure that the alliance works is communication, identifying each group, identifying what they're good at and sharing the responsibilities between them to make sure that the newcomer, the sponsored refugees, has best chance of smooth settlement when everybody's working together in concert. So it is going to be based on the sponsor's experience. In terms of refugees, the PSRs, which is private sponsorship of refugees, and BVORs, the blended visa referral, and the settlement workers. You as a settlement workers play an integral part in the process of helping the newcomers settle in their new community. So the communication between these three elements or the factors are very, very important. So we see a group of people committed together to provide the best possible supports to newcomers so their resettlement and integration in the community is as smooth as possible. So in terms of the obligations that the sponsors have, let's look at the undertaking and settlement supports. As you can see, this is a page that kind of magnified portion of the undertaking and settlement document that the sponsors have to sign, no matter what stream of sponsorship they choose to. They have entered into a legal obligations. Even the term obligations and consent is identified here in declaration. So the sponsors declare and agree that they will provide support starting from the time they receive the newcomers in terms of providing lodging for them, their temporary or permanent place of living, making sure that they're taken care of, that they have enough clothing, food, and their transportation issues are met, getting bus passes for them so they can manage and navigate the community themselves, and all other basic necessities. Of course, settlement assistance and supports, assisting the newcomers, making sure that they do get their English language assessed, making sure that they attend their English classes if they're needing to, and if they're ready for employment, and also encourage them to take more active part in integrating in the community and learning about the life in Canada. And that the sponsors will perform these obligations based on this agreement, and they will assume for liabilities during that period, which is supporting the refugees for the 12 months from the time of the arrival to Canada, or when they become independent, and that we can talk about that as well. Okay, we'll continue with legal obligation. The principal, applicant, and all family members must be taken care of, whether they're accompanying, if they are accompanying with them. And of course, for the non-accompanying family members as well. So there's a legal obligation to provide, make sure that when they will be arriving, that the funds and the settlement supports are in place for them. So this happens in terms of, let's say, the 1-year window opportunity, which provides the PA's dependents to join them in Canada within the first year after the principal applicant arrives to Canada. So the legal obligations is extended as well to the members of the family under the 1-year window program. We'll continue with the financial responsibilities. As we had mentioned, that PSR, privately sponsored refugees, includes the startup costs plus 12 months of income support, meaning that when the family or individual arrives, they will receive one lump sum. We call that startup cost to meet the immediate needs upon arrival, and the rest of the money is divided over the 12 months following after arrival, which will help them support them and take care of their financial needs while they are under that 1-year window support. Of course, the BVOR, Blended Visa Office Referral, we've talked about this last week. It is when the government and the sponsors share the cost of the 12 months, i.e. there's a startup cost paid by the sponsor, and then the rest of the sponsorship cost is divided 6 months between the sponsor, private sponsor, and the government of Canada. So let's look at application versus post-arrival. As we had mentioned earlier, we have the cost table that is kind of the same across Canada versus the RAP rate. And the groups also must provide proof of their funds to make sure that they are in financial position to provide supports. And we do that via the minimum financial support calculator that is available on RSTP website. It's very easy to go there, and will assist the sponsors and the newcomers understand how the money that has been identified for their financial support is calculated. Of course, we have that information on our frequently asked questions, post-arrival financial support, that's available on our STP website on this matter. Okay, let's continue with financial support. So as I mentioned earlier, that the sponsors need to recalculate the amount after the arrival based on the RAP policies, resettlement, and that would be based on the family composition. Composition meaning the parent, children, if they are dependent of dependent, or if they are seniors, and how that works. Of course, we also mentioned that sometimes there are children who reach the age of maturity while the application is in the process. So once they arrive to Canada, they will be 18. And of course, that has to be recalculated and added to the cost of the sponsorship. Possible financial deductions, how could that happen? Declaration of personal fund and assets, in-kind donations, and household employment income, that would take place. What deductions cannot be made? Of course, federal and provincial tax benefits and rebates, those cannot be deducted from the support, meaning that if the family is receiving child tax benefit, that portion of the money that family receives cannot be deducted from financial support, or any kinds of tax benefits and rebates that the federal or the provincial government offers cannot be deducted from the refugee. Funds from the refugees cannot be deducted. Newcomers who choose not to seek employment, they are encouraged to continue attending to enhancing their English language assessment. So newcomers may take a little bit longer time learning English. Therefore, the financial supports will continue. So in terms of financial management, every sponsoring group must provide the proper amount of the financial support. And of course, we all know the importance of making sure that everything is documented, documentations of supports provided, whether it's financial support, of course, also the settlement supports for the sponsors to have a record of all the types of supports they provided, whether it's furniture, whether it was appliances, or whether it was covering some costs. Very, very important. So what would be some of the sponsors' settlement responsibilities in detail? So as we had mentioned before, that the sponsors are responsible to provide settlement support. We know that sponsorship is a two-pronged support. One is financial, one is settlement. And we talked about financial support. In terms of settlement supports, let's look at the different aspects and factors. So where would settlement support start? Of course, it starts at welcoming them at the airport. It is important that the sponsors need to be at the airport, if possible, of course, if not them or someone else to represent them, to greet the family when they arrive. That they had received the notice of arrival from IRCC or ROCO or RSAT telling them the family is arriving and they're there. We've seen cases where families arrive and their sponsors are not there due to the fact that the sponsors could have changed their emails or passed away or something happened and the new people arriving to Canada without anybody greeting them. So fortunately, we have some arrangements made in different airports to meet people when they arrive from overseas to assist them. In terms of orienting them to life in Canada, how is life in Canada, how things are done. Of course, we know that our life here in Canada is very different from other countries. I know that myself, when my family arrived here, I was a very young girl. Even then, as a young girl, I noticed that life is different here in Canada than where we had come from. As I mentioned in the past, my family immigrated to Canada from Iraq. As part of the sponsors' responsibilities is making sure that they have arranged either temporary accommodation or they have already established permanent accommodation, or They are sort of where most people do provide a temporary accommodation for the family upon arrival for a few weeks or a couple of months, and then help them find their permanent accommodation. And this, of course, depends on the undertaking applications as to how the shelter costs are calculated, whether the family is going to be living with the sponsors, and of course shelter deduction is provided to the sponsors, or if the family is moving to their own home, then of course the shelter has to be covered by the sponsors. Making transportation arrangements, making sure that the newcomers have access to public transit, helping them get a bus pass. Of course, there are different procedures in different cities in terms of getting reduced bus passes. Also help them, show them how to use the public system and how to travel in the city, or if the families have members, the sponsors who will take on the role of driving them around for the beginning time. Very, very important is that within the first week is to make sure that they apply for their healthcare card, no matter what province they are. And of course, the provincial and federal government have agreements between them in terms of who covers what upon arrival. That all takes place by the support of you as settlement worker, by guiding them towards the necessary documents that they need to fill in order to receive their provincial healthcare card. Of course, as we know that upon arrival, the newcomers need to be guided to go for what we call initial medical exams, and also to dentists and other medical services. We have noticed that a lot of people arriving who had lived as refugees for a long time in different locations, that dental issue is a major new expense that the sponsors must cover if there's a need, which is above and beyond their actual sponsorship cost. The dental issues caused mostly by living in stressful situations, poor nutrition, and so on, so on. So this is a cost that the sponsors need to know, that they will have to provide for any kind of intervention, that it has to be above and beyond the actual financial responsibilities. If the family who arrived have young children, the settlement workers and the family and the sponsors, of course, will guide the family towards the procedures, how to enroll their children in the school. Assist the adults in terms of applying for tax benefits if they have children, of course, or other deductions. Encourage the adults to fill in their GST forms right away and tax returns, although they do not pay taxes in the first year because they're exempt, mostly because that whatever income they receive from the sponsorship is really below the threshold, so they do not pay taxes on the money they receive for the sponsorship. Therefore, the sponsorship support is not taxable for the newcomers. Of course,
I have a question about that, sorry.
Yes.
So if they are working, but they are on the first year of settlement, are they exempt of paying taxes?
Yes, if they have an income from working, then the sponsors or settlement workers need to guide them and help them recalculate the sponsorship costs on our RAP calculator. You can enter the information and how much money they're receiving from their employment, and you'll see that they have to pay taxes when they're employed, right? So those deductions are made by their employers.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
No problem.
Clear. I was just a little bit confused. Thank you.
Yeah. So if they're receiving 100% money from their sponsors, that money is not taxable. Should they choose to work as well, let's say on top of that. So if they're working, the employer is obligated, of course, to make those tax deductions, EI deductions, Canada pension deductions, right? And if they had deducted too much, of course, when they do their income tax end of the year, based on the family size and how much they received, all those done automatically by Revenue Canada. But their actual money from the sponsors is not taxable. Okay. So if we have adults who are needing to improve their English language skills. They can be enrolled in local link classes or ESL classes, depending on their level of English. So that is very important that the sponsors carry out with this responsibility. And as I mentioned earlier, the settlement worker in a settlement agency such as yourself will make a referral for the adults for English language benchmark assessment. And based on the results, they will be referred to a class so they can improve their English language skill. And if they had come to Quebec, of course, they will receive French as well. Also very important at the very beginning that the family and the sponsors are guided either by you or by their experienced members, that the newcomers fill in their social insurance number and make sure that every member has it, of course, with a PR card that's done initially upfront. And also part of the sponsor's responsibilities is to promote activities that will help the newcomers better establish themselves, things such as learning how to use the, let's say, public transit, access rec and leisure activities, and engage in community activities, their own community, let's say ethnic community or religious community or larger community at large, that will help them develop a strong social network and the relationship in the community as well. Besides, along with all of this, part of the sponsor's responsibility is to provide emotional and moral support. We know that sometimes the newcomers may experience sadness or remorse for leaving family behind or adjusting to new life in Canada and may feel that they're overwhelmed. So part of the sponsor's responsibility is to provide emotional and moral support, but not to become the therapist. We also encourage the sponsors that if they notice that the newcomers are struggling with some issues, is to make sure that they refer them to local emotional health service providers for professional support. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, make sure that their PR card applications are submitted. That's something that you as a settlement worker play a big role assisting at the beginning. We also now know that in some provinces or in some locations, although the PR is a federal government issue, that there's a big delay. I just heard from many people when we had a community session that sometimes PR cards are taking 6 to 7 months for it to arrive, and this is causing a lot of grief. So following up with permanent residency documentation with the government is important to continuously ask them what's happening with the PR card and what's happening with the PR card. It's very, very important. Of course, very, very important, I would like to put this open a bank account up front on top of the list, right after arriving and arranging for their temporary accommodation and accessing services, is to help the family open a bank account. As you know, the money that's collected and secured at IRC for the IRCC application is held by the sponsors here in various forms, because you cannot open a bank account for somebody who is not a PR in Canada or has no status. So once the individual, the family arrives, the sponsor's responsibility, or they should be guided to assist the newcomers open a bank account, show them how it's done, help them through that process, review the budget with them to make sure that they understand how much money they'll be receiving every month, and assist them with understanding that there are initial obligations that needs to be taken care of, such as paying for the rent and utilities and things like that. So assisting them with understanding how much money they have coming to them every month and how to budget their expenses every month, as long as they know that that money is there for the first 12 months. As this is part of what we call as the financial orientation. As I mentioned earlier, help them connect them with the community, whether they're ethnocultural community or religious community or community at large, community resources and programs that will help them develop friendships, relationships, and social network. Of course, that could lead into long-term relationship with many community members here in Canada. And on top of the list for me, as far as I understand and accept, is that to connect the newcomers with settlement service providers. This is very, very important, because you as a settlement worker play a very, very, very big role in guiding the sponsors and the newcomers about the services and the programs that are available in the community. That's why we call this as an alliance between the sponsors, the newcomers, and settlement workers, because the sponsors would provided the funds and do all the legwork in terms of providing some supports, but you as a settlement workers will be able to guide the sponsors and the newcomers after your initial needs assessment to the suitable and appropriate programs and services that they need to assist them with their settlement in Canada. Through that, you also will be facilitating and empowering them, because they would know about their rights and their responsibilities and feel more confident as they settle into their new life here in Canada. Settlement supports, as we had said, upon arrival, review and update the settlement plan. Sometimes things change for the family composition. Also engage the newcomers in the settlement planning, through asking questions, assessing what are their needs, making sure the residency requirements have been met for if they have come through a SAW or CG. CG is constituent groups and co-sponsor. If they had come through groups of 5, or if they came through the community sponsor. If the individual or family moves to another community, then they must find and secure other sponsors or representative in the community to continue providing settlement supports. And the financial supports will be continued by the sponsors. So in terms of working with settlement agencies, this portion of the undertaking settlement agreement that the sponsors have to complete and sign and submit, as you can see here in that undertaking, which is the legal agreement that the sponsors enter, is that the sponsors need to know and identify which settlement service provider in their community they're going to be using and accessing once the newcomers arrive, and for what services. So this way, the sponsor have scanned the community, identified what settlement service providers are available in the community, and can guide the newcomers to receive professional support from settlement workers such as yourself. And this is very, very important part of the sponsorship. In the past, a lot of the sponsors, especially in group of 5 and community sponsorship, weren't as aware and have not emphasized on this as much, thinking that as long as they have the money to cover the sponsorship costs, the settlement support is not as important to the government. No, it is. And this, since 2018, this portion has been identified as just as important from day one as the financial support that's required. So this way, IRCC is encouraging the sponsors to scan the community and find what settlement services available nearby where the newcomer will be living, and what services they're going to access based on the family size and composition, and detailed information about what kind of supports and services they will be receiving from the settlement supports. And if you have any questions that you need technical support with, of course, you can contact Serena at eTraining. However, about the information, the content, we'll be more than happy to give you information. The other thing we have also here about Settlement Support Connections Project, we've talked about this in the past, where we are collaborating with the sponsors to help them identify a settlement worker who's trained by us, such as yourself, to access services from them, because we have able to locate settlement workers in different regions across Canada who will provide settlement support to the newcomers. Hopefully they speak the language of the newcomers as well and familiar with the culture, and so on and so on. Thank you for joining me here today and sharing your feedback with the rest of the group. And do hope that you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. And we'll see you next Tuesday.